Well, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, friends. This is Casey Gwinn, the president of Alliance for Hope International, and we're very honored to have you joining us today. I'm joined by Gael Strack, the founder and really the visionary behind the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, and Dr. Bill Smock, who I will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But we're very honored to have you all on this call, along with Trish and Carly and our team at the Training Institute. So thank you for being with us today. We are going to be doing an extended webinar today because we have so much to share about non-fatal and near-fatal strangulation. We will be focusing primarily on what we've learned in 2018. We'll be touching on some of our history and background, but for those of you who have not attended our courses, this is not a Strangulation 101 course or the basics. This is really more of an advanced course. It's the information that we are producing and the information that we are finding in our research and our work across the country and around the world. And that's our focus today for this webinar. As we begin our webinar today, I would just like to take a moment to remember two female rookie police officers who have died in the last 36 hours in the United States. Shreveport officer Shatari Payne was killed, we believe, in a domestic violence-related incident in Shreveport, Louisiana. And just last night and even early this morning, it actually happened. Davis police officer Natalie Corona, who was 22 years old, was killed, shot and killed while investigating a car accident. We have no word on the killer yet. The killer ended up killing himself. One of our own staff members, Rayanne Passantino, had to shelter in place at a pizza parlor very near where the shooting occurred while they were searching for the shooter. This is obviously stunningly tragic, and the fact that at least one of these, and perhaps both, are connected to a rage-filled man, likely with a history of violence and abuse against women, is a very sobering way to begin our webinar here about what we've learned in 2018. There was also just 36 hours ago a murder-suicide in Jefferson County, Alabama, with a domestic violence history. A woman was shot and killed, and then the man shot and killed himself after walking down the road with a gun in his hand, and police officers attempting to confront him. So real life, and a sobering reminder that this webinar is not just about statistics, and it's not just about vague information about the lives of people impacted by rage-filled men. It's real life, and many are experiencing this violence even as we speak. News is breaking even this morning as we start this webinar about a very high-profile case with a football coach in Colorado, with a survivor who has reached out to us for support, and a sentencing hearing that is going on this morning where the district attorney will be making a decision whether or not to plea bargain a strangulation case down to a misdemeanor or to cause the football coach to face the real consequences of his actions now that he has pled guilty. So as we begin today, we remember those who have lost their lives, family members who are mourning, and these two officers as well, in the tragic outcomes that have happened in the last 36 hours. It's my honor to be on this call, as I mentioned, with Gael Strack, our CEO at Alliance for Hope International, and the founder of the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, and Dr. Bill Smock, who is a police surgeon in Louisville Metro, Kentucky, and is also the director of our national advisory team and our medical committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also want to thank Catherine Sullivan. Many of you know her as Katie, who is the director of the Office on Violence Against Women. At the present time, we love her passion and leadership of OVW and appreciate the way we have been able to work so closely with her on a couple of other key initiatives, as well as our Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And I want to especially thank our program manager, Kevin Sweeney, who is just gold to us and has done such a great job over the years of working with us, collaborating with us, and really making our work possible as he oversees the funding that we receive from the Office on Violence Against Women in the U.S. Department of Justice. For those of you that may be new to this, as I mentioned, this won't be a 101 kind of a call, but the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention is one of the major programs of Alliance for Hope International. And we have been working really very aggressively with the Justice Department and with many other communities since 2011 through the Institute. Obviously, Gail and others did a lot of work long before 2011, going back into the mid-1990s. We are funded by the U.S. Department of Justice to provide comprehensive training and technical assistance to communities around strangulation assaults, and we also get hired by communities regularly. And people obviously come to our courses as well, 1-day, 2-day, and 4-day courses. Our institute goals, which you can find at strangulationtraininginstitute.org or .com, really is increase information, knowledge, understanding of professionals of all kinds, police officers, prosecutors, advocates, doctors, nurses, therapists, anybody working with victims of near fatal and non-fatal strangulation and sexual assault and domestic violence and child abuse and elder abuse and human trafficking, but also really to advocate and improve policy and procedure and practice around the country, and to really do both of those things at the bottom of that slide, to increase offender accountability and to enhance victim safety. This is our team. We always like to give a quick shout out to our team at Alliance for Hope International. Dr. Chan Hellman is the head of our research team. He's the director of the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma. You'll see in those pictures Carly and Trish, who are with us here in our webinar broadcast room in San Diego today. And you will also see something at the bottom of that slide on the right, which is brand new, which is that we are happy to announce that Dr. Bill Smock is going to become the National Medical Director for the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. As Bill begins to move toward wrapping up his career in Louisville, Kentucky, we have offered him a position to come onto our team and to serve as our national medical director. Without question, Bill is one of the leading researchers and practitioners in the country and even in the world on the handling of near fatal and non-fatal strangulation cases and gunshot wounds, which is an area of specialty of his as well. So we're so honored to announce today that Dr. Bill Smock will begin to serve as the medical director for the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention.
Can we applaud?
No, that is
Gotta have fun.
He is worthy of that. And I mentioned Trish and Carly, but there are their pictures. We appreciate them and all the work they do with Gail at the Institute and for leading this webinar today. We also want to give you a quick reminder about our conference coming up in March. We host an International Family Justice Center conference every year. In recent years, we've been traveling around the country, but we're coming home to San Diego beginning in 2019. We will be at Paradise Point Resort and Spa on Mission Bay. And if you are at all interested, I encourage you to go to familyjusticecenter.org or .com and go to allianceforhope.com, and you will see the opportunity to register. It's coming up fast. The hotel is almost full. We've almost sold the hotel out. We would love to have you join us. We're the only conference in the country where people come almost entirely in multidisciplinary teams to our conference, and communities bring elected officials, they bring policymakers, they bring people working in the trenches, doctors, nurses, cops, prosecutors, advocates, therapists, all kinds of professions, as we advocate for collaborative and integrated approaches to creating a community for survivors, both during the crisis and long after the crisis. So please register fast, get your hotel room fast. We're filling up. We have 2 upcoming advanced strangulation courses that are available, though they too will fill up very, very fast. The course in Fort Worth, which we host at One Safe Place in partnership with the largest family justice center facility in the state of Texas, is May 6th to 10th, 2019. And then in October, we'll be back in San Diego for another 4-day course. Many people are now trying to get into those courses, and we will continue to put out information about that. If you're not on our mailing list, please make sure you get on our mailing list so we can give you those details. Just a special thank you as we begin to everybody on this call for the work you're doing day in and day out. We have no doubt that it is incredibly challenging to try to make change in your agencies and your systems. There's so much minimization, so much rationalization around the topic of near and non-fatal strangulation. Thank you for your passion in advocating, for creating new tools, for joining us in trainings and webinars like this, and then taking this information to others so that we can continue to multiply. I'm going to turn it over to Carly and Trish for a minute here, and we're going to do a quick poll. you will see polling come up if you are actually on the webinar platform. And we'd like you just quickly to go ahead and answer questions that are being launched on the screen. You have the opportunity to identify who you are on the call, and then to answer a few other questions. And you'll see there we're interested in whether or not you have been in a previous training, what discipline you represent. If you have been to a training, whether you've been to a 1-day, 2-day, or 4-day training. We're also very excited about the opportunity to have you submit any questions with things that you've struggled with. You can do that both on this platform and through the webinar platform so that we can try to be responsive when we get to the end of our presentation if there are other things that we can touch on or follow up with after we go through this. So first, discipline, and then the second question is what kind of training have you received? We are doing as many trainings as we can around the country, but the reality is that it is very, very difficult to get enough capacity for everybody that wants to come to one of our trainings. It's great to see that a very significant number of you have been to the 4-Day Institute that are answering right now. Some, obviously, it looks like about a quarter of the people on the call have never been to one of our trainings. You can go to strangulationtraininginstitute.com, by the way, at any time. And if you go to scheduled trainings, you can see what's happening all over the country, where Gail's speaking, where I'm speaking, where Dr. Smock is speaking, or others on our team, Lieutenant Dan Rincon from Scottsdale, or Jerry Feynman from the Riverside DA's office, or others. But we appreciate you answering those questions so that we can get a little bit of a sense of all of that. This webinar is going to focus on a whole variety of topics, and it'll be somewhat like a speed dating exercise. We're going to move really fast today because we have so much information and this field is developing so quickly. We're going to do our best to share a little bit of the history, a lot of information on what we're learning in the medical area, the criminal justice area, advocacy, and really try to highlight a few trends around best practices. So whether or not you've been on the webinar or before, we hope there'll be something in it for all of you. Just as we kind of dive in, some big paintbrush themes that we saw in 2018. This issue of criminal justice reform, which is a very significant issue for many, has come up in relation to bail. Some of you that have been to our courses know that we're tracking. Gail became very passionate months ago about tracking people who are getting killed by those out on bail or those that have been released from custody. And there's a kind of a broad brushstroke out there of we should not have people in jail or let people out of jail. You will see that in our work, we're extremely concerned about stranglers getting out of jail prematurely, domestic violence offenders getting out of jail. So bail, not that we're against criminal justice reform, but we're very concerned about this whole issue of letting dangerous people out of jail in America. We're starting to think a lot more about batterers and who they are and who the stranglers are of domestic violence. The man who slaps a woman, I often say, is an idiot, but the man who strangles a woman is a killer. Those two abusers are not the same. So we're giving a lot of thought to that. You'll be hearing more about that in 2019. It's not so much batter typology as it really is beginning to understand the rage history of those who strangle and suffocate women. Spending a lot of time with Dr. Jackie Campbell and many others on this topic of traumatic brain injury and the impact on the brain. We've learned so much in the last couple of years about the impact of brain damage. It's very similar, strangulation assaults, to waterboarding or to torture or to things that actually literally shrink the brain of human beings and cause significant brain injury that is not being diagnosed and treated. The word bringing pops up because more and more people are bringing us to their communities. People are inviting us to come do the 2-day or 1-day or 4-day course in communities rather than sending teams to our trainings. And we're doing the best we can to accomplish that. We're already close to booking into 2020 and 2021, but we are committed to trying to do that as much as we can. And then a big theme clearly is the need for more and more specialized training. You can't win these cases without experts. Prosecutors need to better understand how to counteract the defense as we get more aggressive in prosecuting these cases, the defense bar gets more aggressive as well in defending these cases. So we've got a number of areas there, experts in prosecution in the relation to probation and parole and gunshots as well. And then, as you can see there, we're giving a lot of thought to how we can continue to develop new kinds of courses and different kinds of courses. We did do a survey just recently to our community, to many of you that may be on this call, and we just wanted to share some of those results from those that we have been training, those that have been to our 4-day course. And just quickly, you can see some of those things. You can see that lack of specialized investigators, lack of specialized prosecutors, lack of specially trained judges has an impact. That on-scene investigation piece is important, but what jumps out at you on that slide is the lack of expert testimony, the failure of prosecutors in this country to identify experts and get them on the witness stand, because you cannot prosecute these cases successfully as felonies, particularly with minimal visible injury, unless you have strong expert testimony. I also want to just say Happy New Year to all of you. I know these are difficult times in the United States of America, certainly challenging times with the controversies about the budget in Washington, D.C., even as we speak. But we're excited about 2019. We're excited about our work with the Office for Victims of Crime and the Office on Violence Against Women. We're excited about the passion that we're seeing around the country on this topic of near and non-fatal strangulation. And we're really excited about the opportunities to continue to expand our work in 2019. And that's probably a good place for me as we think about dreaming big in this work, even as we report 2018 lessons learned, to turn it over to really our leader and our founder in all of this, and that's Gael Strack, who is both our CEO at Alliance for Hope International and is really the passionate leader behind the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. So Gael, thanks for continuing to push us forward in 2018 and on into the future.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Casey. And thank you for really warm welcome and reflection of still where we are and where we need to go. Well, I'm very excited, and I'm going to jump in because this webinar is going to be a very difficult one, as Casey said, but I want to highlight one more thing. This is a 2-hour webinar with no time for questions and answers. That means we need you to start typing in your questions or comments now. If we don't have the chance to respond to it immediately today, we will definitely cover it in this next week, but there is a lot to cover. This particular webinar is really near and dear to me because it allows me the opportunity and our team to really reflect what happened in 2018. And it is an enormous project, but it's also fun at the same time because it's like looking for and finding buried treasure. There are even unopened emails or things I didn't even read, but they're going to be included. So as we were preparing this webinar for you, we thought, let's all reflect and let's all dream big for the new year. And we thought the best place to start is reflection and assessment. Where are you today? Sometimes when we do this training, we even challenge communities to give themselves a grade as they assess themselves. Going on to the next slide, you're going to see 2 self-assessment tools that we are bringing to everyone's attention. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has really come up with a great agency assessment to really assess your response to strangulation by taking a great look at your police reports. The Institute has come up with, I would call, more of a community evaluation to see what is happening. Most recently, we did it at a community that we were training with, and some of the answers really surprised all of us. So I would say take a look at that. It'd be a great way to start and then take those results to the next level. Speaking of the next level, we have something new coming up, and I think within the next week, it should be there. We're going to have a new look for our website. And as you know, we just recently put in a new resource library, and our goal is always to put something new on our website each and every day, whether it's a news story, whether it's case law, or a new resource that has been developed. But now we're going to have just a new look to make things even easier for you to access new information. For example, in news stories from 2018, Rebecca Lovelace, the former director of the Napa Family Justice Center, was with us, and we were busy getting ready, and she offered to help. And she goes, Gail, how can I help? I go, well, why don't you read all of our news stories from 2018 that we posted on our website and tell me what you think? And if you look at her picks, it's like, oh my gosh, look at these headlines that we all saw. So one of the things that for those of you who are new, what we do is we actually search for and get Google alerts on just about everything related to domestic violence, choking, strangulation, officers who are shot. And then we go through and really pick the best of the best because we know all of you are really busy. But just take a look at a couple of these headlines. Men think they can get away with choking as it is rarely leaves a mark. So I can't see that one part on the side. Domestic violence is overlooked. Concussions of brain. Preventing murder by addressing domestic violence. Traumatic brain injury as the unseen impact of domestic violence. Mass shootings. And even the mayor, we most recently were in Salt Lake City, and the mayor was very touched and very proud of the fact that she was able to launch the training there and forensic exams for domestic violence victims. And when it comes to forensic exams for domestic violence victims, Casey will be talking about that. But I do want to salute all the forensic nurses out there who have been sexual assault nurses and have taken this as their personal mission to expand their work and include domestic violence victims. I think most of you on this call know and appreciate the need for forensic exams for the victim who's strangled, because much like sexual assault, the injuries require special attention, special training, and documentation. So a lot of great stories to read. And when you have the time, I would take a look. The other thing we want to share with you are videos. We didn't realize it. It's funny is that when you do pull everything together at the end of the year, you realize, oh, this is the reason why I'm tired. And oh my gosh, we did pull a lot of information together. So a couple of things we want to highlight that's available for you is that we have a new 30-minute training video, thanks to Michael Burke and the fire department and others, for paramedics that will help you assess a strangled victim. We also have the danger of strangulation, which is a short video on how EMS can evaluate the strangled victim. And that is a good how-to by our firefighters here in San Diego. We lovingly call him Mitch, who is just like awesome. The last warning shot is something we're very proud of, with a new 10-minute lineup video that was prepared for Colorado. Oregon, oh my gosh, if I would say out of all these videos, if I were to pick one, I have been watching the Oregon State Senate Committee several times now, and it's very powerful. And quite frankly, it's like a training webinar in and of itself. And I haven't been able to get through the video without crying. It is very passionate, powerful, and it goes right to your heart. And I even said to folks that if they didn't pass their felony strangulation law this year, I quit. And fortunately, they passed, and I can still do what I'm very passionate about. But I take now clips from that particular Senate committee and insert it into my training. So for the trainers in the room, take a look at that. And what we're doing is editing it for our trainers who have attended our 4-day course and how you can use that. But I would say the next one would be hot off the presses. This was a special request by the medical professionals that they needed something short and quick. So Dr. Bill Smock has put together that short 4-minute video for the busy doctor, nurses, and the trauma hospitals that you can take a look at that will get you to where you need to be. And then the other thing we want to highlight are some webinars that we were able to do. Oh, they're also really powerful. I would say handling strangulation cases on the front lines with Jackie Campbell. That was probably our most well-attended with about 1,300. Strangulation survivors is though near and dear to my heart. We probably had about 800 attendees there. So take a look. They're all awesome. And going back to signs and symptoms, as I'm going to try to speed things up, is that we added something new. Obviously, an adult female victim. We added one for children. And at the request, this one really touched our heart as well, at the request of some students from Prairie View A&M University, They wanted to do their own public awareness campaign to bring attention to the issue of non-fatal strangulation to students. And they specifically asked us to come up with a new signs and symptoms, and we are affectionately calling her Asha. It is the, I think it, African word for either hope or life. Okay. And so thank you, Carly, for picking out the name. So we appreciate that. It's a team effort. Going to the next slide, speaking about team effort. From the very beginning, since we were awarded the grant from OVW, we knew that we needed to bring the best minds and experts together. And so since 2012, we've been bringing that great group together. The national advisors are now growing and growing, and Casey will share a little bit more. In fact, now is the time to probably share that.
Yeah, as we've continued to have more and more graduates of our 4-day course and more people really being capable of doing their own training, taking our materials, recognizing and honoring the work of the Institute, but then going forward yourselves, we have seen that we have many more people that may or may not be able to fit on our National Advisory Board, but they certainly have the ability to teach us as well. So this year we hosted our first master's course. The master's course is a 3-day course that can occur that occurs after people have graduated from our 4-day course. And we were very excited to get to host that this year. Many doctors, many nurses, many law enforcement leaders, many advocacy leaders. And as we got to host the master's course, you can get a little sense from our slides kind of what happened. Gail and I were talking a number of months ago about what excited you the most? What excited you the most about the master's course? We couldn't really pick anything. It was just a very intense 3 days and a level of thinking and brainstorming and dialogue that we don't generally have in our 1-day course or 2-day or 4-day course, because so many are taking this so much further. So you can see some of the topic areas that we focused on during that day, particularly thinking how to create a framework for more specialized groups within the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. There was a lot of dreaming. Some of you know when we get hired by communities to do strategic planning for family justice centers, we use big purple sticky walls, and now we pretty much use big purple sticky walls, say that 10 times fast, pretty much everywhere we go. And we used them there at the master's course as they got to thinking and dreaming about where can we go, what can we do, how can we expand this and push it out further. And they helped us really identify strategic directions for the Institute in 2019, focusing on areas that seem like they're overwhelming, but we just couldn't narrow it down any more than those you see on the screen. We've got a few thousand people that have gone through our 4-day course. We had 100 plus at our master's course. But if you think about all the people that need more information around the country, we're talking about tens of millions of people that we've got to be able to get to. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of doctors and police officers and prosecutors. So they helped us really create a really big agenda for 2019 and beyond. We have refined and kind of expanded our medical advisory committee, working with the Academy of Forensic Nursing and working with doctors from across the country and now around the world, working with Dr. Jackie Campbell and others in this whole area of TBI and the impact of brain injury from asphyxial events and concussive events. So we're excited now to have a really well-rounded medical advisory committee. We've also now created a legal advisory committee, which met during the master's course. And that legal advisory committee, which is made up of law enforcement and prosecutors and criminal defense lawyers, we really are excited about that because we have a lot more to do on that.
And 2 judges.
And 2 judges and judges joining us, both retired judges and active duty, currently serving judges. We've got a small advocacy advisory committee that we just started at the master's course, and we hope to grow that advisory committee as well with survivors, with advocates from community-based agencies, government-based agencies, family justice center directors. But we are excited about that journey ahead with our specialized committees within the Institute.
All right, so now it's history as part of our focus area for each and every one of our presentations. As you can see here, I've always said our history is still the reality of many communities. And then this year I was inspired by a quote from Martin Luther King that we are not makers of history, we are made by history. So I think we can learn from that. And as many of you know, I never even start a presentation or end a presentation without thinking about Cassandra Stewart and Tamara Smith, the two young women who changed my life personally forever and has been the inspiration for this work. As Casey and I, when we were prosecutors, this happened under our watch, and we were determined never to let this happen again. Meaning that before Cassandra and Tamara, for those of you who are new to our world, before they were brutally murdered in domestic violence incidents, each one of them had been choked, as we used to call it at that time, and neither case got prosecuted. Today, I believe those cases are being prosecuted, and those two women would be alive today. But in that journey, we promised their parents that their daughters would never die in vain. And each and every time we do a training, a webinar, a podcast, whatever it is, I feel that we honor their memory and we're educating others. So thank you all for joining us in this work. And through the course, for those of you who are new, I would say the Journal of Emergency Medicine, thanks to Dr. Ellen Tolliver, who pulled us all together, was the first series of articles that laid the groundwork for our work that we're doing and the learning that we have made. First of all, we learned from survivors by doing focus groups at a hospital and a focus group with survivors from a shelter. And they were able to help us articulate those signs and symptoms that is still consistent today. We took a look at the legal issues for investigation, the clinical issues on what can we do for clinical documentation. We also learned from Dr. Dean Hawley about what can we learn from fatal cases and apply that to non-fatal. And then even back then, we were already very concerned about the impact of multiple strangulations, traumatic brain injury, and the long-term consequences. So a frequent question that we get is, I'm new to this, I want to learn, but obviously you don't want to read all the 200 plus articles that we have identified. So initially, Dr. Dean Hawley identified his top picks, and I call it Dean's Picks Plus. In other words, you could start with what he likes, and the other ones you will see are the ones that we like. And I do want to make a caution for those of you who end up testifying as an expert. Even though these articles are important, and it's going to enrich your understanding about strangulation. In fact, I tend to, and I'm going to probably disclose too much information here, but I tend to read all these articles every year over again because I'm always finding something new that I didn't pick up before. So I think these articles are worth reading, but I would say if you end up testifying as an expert, just let people know that you continue to expand your knowledge about strangulation by reading the articles, but there's not one particular article that you rely on, because it will just open yourself up to somebody taking that article, cross-examining you about that. And that's not necessary because all of this enriches our knowledge. So going to the next, what I wanted to say is one issue that has come up, and I've been keeping track of it, is that early on in our research, we found that at least 50% of the time, victims will not have visible injuries. And there's been a number of studies that have been done subsequently. And they've been done in different settings under different circumstances. So sometimes you're comparing apples to oranges. But if you look at the big scope of it all the way from 1995 when we did our original study to 2017, it's been very consistent. Most victims will not have visible injuries, and if they do, it's minor. Most of those injuries are going to appear the next day or after, unless it was a brutal hand-to-hand combat to stay alive. And you will see in the last bottom two columns is now we're keeping track of, in these short and small studies, of the number of victims that have fractures, have carotid dissections. And the more we learn, the more we talk, the more we do the CTAs, the more we are finding those positive findings. So if you want to go big and go deep, I would say take a look at the strangulation bibliography, both for the adult victim and children. We're currently updating it now with our medical advisory group. But overall, what I want to summarize in this, as we change channels to go to power and control, is that the original articles are still awesome. And the last time I talked to Dr. Ralph Riviello, he said, Gail, you need to know that these articles are still one of the most downloaded articles. So I say they're solid. I would say keep thinking. Let's keep pushing each other. We still have a lot more research articles to think about and many other articles to write. And I would say the last one is we are just scratching the surface. As much as we have learned, I think that each and every day we're learning something new. So Casey, what can we summarize about power and control?
Thanks, Gail. I will say, by the way, all of this is available in our resource library online. So we have worked with the Office on Violence Against Women to create a resource library. You can access it through strangulationtraininginstitute.com or .org. You can also access it through familyjusticecenter.com or .org. So everything that we're flying through here, including all the new articles, we regularly are adding them to our online resource library for you. I think probably the biggest theme in 2018 around this dynamic of power and control was really continuing to get the word out that the strangler is not the same person as the slapper. Yes, the slapper may be attempting to use power and control, but the strangler is taking that to the end of the lethality chart. The strangler is saying, I can kill you. And many, many years ago, a survivor that came into the San Diego Family Justice Center and then joined our Voices Committee said this to us. She said, actually, when I came out of that incident, I was more submissive, more terrified that the next time I might not come out, I might not make it. So I think I gave him all of my power from there because I could see how easy it was for him to just take my life like he had given it to me. That statement is what has led us in 2018 to begin using this phrase. Stranglers have a loaded God complex. Stranglers are much like a loaded gun. They want victims to know that they can kill them anytime they want, that the strangler is God and she is not. And when Ruth said those words many years ago, we saw it as a power and control dynamic and a way to rob a victim of power and control in her own life. But we never really fully understood the difference between the strangler and the slapper or the puncher or the kicker. Now, a strangler may also slap, punch, and kick, to be sure, but predators go for the neck. Killers go for the neck. This whole dynamic of the neck, which is the most vulnerable part of the human body and the fastest way to kill somebody on the human body, that's why we have begun to focus and use this language in the way we're talking about men who strangle women. As we were just on this call, we actually I've been texting with somebody asking for advice about a guy up in Idaho who just got out of jail for strangulation. And the response of the folks getting him out was, we want to support him. The victim has left the community because she's so scared, and we want to try to hold him accountable. That sounds great. And I said, be careful. He's the most dangerous man on the planet. And the fact that he feels really sorry right now and he's getting out of jail on bail before the case goes forward does not mean that he's not the scariest man they're ever going to interact with. And stranglers aren't just a danger to the victim. They're a danger to lots of other folks as well. So that piece is obviously really important. We've also done a lot of focus groups over the last 3 years. We continued that trend in 2018. One of the great passions of our organization is survivor feedback, accountability to survivors, listening to the voices of survivors, understanding how they're experiencing this. And we have continued this last year to hear survivors saying it wasn't treated seriously. They made it a misdemeanor. They plea bargained it to a misdemeanor. They didn't prosecute it. They didn't see any visible injuries at the scene, so they didn't do a full investigation. Those things we're hearing over and over again. And then later, these other injuries are coming out, these long-term health consequences, so many things that we will touch on here. But our challenge to you in every community as we head into 2019 is you need to be doing focus groups with survivors. And I asked this in a community just recently planning a family justice center. I said, how do you get survivor feedback? And they said, we have a comment box. and we have a survey they can fill out. And I said, that's worthless. You need to be sitting down with survivors, feed them breakfast, feed them lunch, feed them dinner, honor them, give them gift cards, and ask them how your community is doing, particularly women who have had pressure applied to their neck or have been suffocated, because we are spending so much money failing victims in the way we're responding, and survivors are continuing to hear it happen. I mentioned this case going on as we speak in Colorado today, the sentencing, a very serious felony case where they're looking at a plea bargain down to a misdemeanor and virtually no time in jail at all. And so for us, this focus group piece has really been important still in 2018.
Okay, thank you, Casey. I definitely echo what Casey said about focus groups. We have learned so much. The only thing I would add, we have actually learned from the survivors how to improve our investigations. It was the survivors in particular, as you might remember, Casey, that told us to change the form because there was a lot more hair pulling than we appreciated. And they were the ones that specifically also helped us understand the thyroid issues.
That's right.
And that was accidental. And then we were able to call Dr. Bill Smock and say, is there any connection between strangulation and some thyroid issues? So a lot is being learned. And I was just talking to Betty Taylor in Australia, and that's one of the next things we're going to do. Because they even will inform you as to the research that needs to be done in the future. So, oh my gosh, it just is so powerful. So now switching to the law. I think the law is very powerful. And I also like to say the law is very sexy. And then you mix in the medical piece. Oh my gosh, it's like so exciting and fascinating at the same time. Because one of the reasons that we had a huge problem when we figured out we were missing strangulation is that we didn't have a law. We didn't have protocol. We didn't have the training. So the law is really our pathway. So I want to say congratulations to all the states that have passed strangulation laws. It is not an easy thing to do. Anybody who's tried to pass any kind of law knows it is difficult, hard work. But then when you get your law passed, the next big piece is how are you going to implement it? So I thought we'd just have a little journey about all the people that are probably on this call who are the ones who got their laws passed. But as you can see here, we are getting close to our ultimate goal of all 50 states. The reds will, the states highlighted in red represent public law jurisdictions. So we've been doing a lot of work with our friends at the NAC and Leslie Hagan. I want to come back and highlight this particular video of the year because it is really powerful. And what this Senator Hayward talked about, who was also a doctor and a survivor, is that she explained better than I had ever seen before about how terrifying it is when you have the inability to breathe. And as I was watching her segment, and I've watched it over and over again, I think that is a goal that we should have for 2019 is how can we do a better job of asking questions and documenting how terrifying the inability to breathe is for a victim. And then we can communicate that better in the courtroom. So going to the next slide, I want to highlight where we are as well. We've got essentially 47 states that have passed some form of a felony strangulation statute, and they've been very creative in some states to do it. But I wanted to highlight the fact that we still have a few more to go, and including our territories. So for me, I think I'm going to just, for fun, reach out to American Samoa again, Puerto Rico, and of course the Mariana Islands, just to go see our friends. Wouldn't that be a nice journey?
That's one of your goals in 2019.
Yeah, go to the U.S. territories. Why not? But let's go and talk about some of the other things that was like, oh my gosh, this one is like jumped up and down. Dr. Dean Hawley, he has been an angel in everything that he has done for us since the early or mid 1900s. But Dean was really our advocate to get this law passed. In other words, to include strangulation and suffocation into the military code. And I just want everybody to know it happened and it took effect. in January 1 of 2019. This document is like 856 pages and buried in page 124 through 127. It was there. So you don't have to go read the whole thing. Carly has actually condensed it and put it in a PDF so you could see it. The challenge will be is that it does not actually define strangulation or suffocation, but VAWA 2013 did that. I was just at Camp Pendleton yesterday with 200 professionals there, and their whole prosecution team was there, and they were very excited to try to figure out how to implement this law. So that was pretty cool.
So the reality is that we've now got a felony to prosecute under the UCMJ. Military prosecutors have a statute. It's not, and two things happened in that Defense Act authorization. One is the strangulation and suffocation piece. The other is that domestic violence is now called out specifically and defined in the UCMJ. So both of those things are very exciting.
Yes. And speaking about what else is exciting, I just want to give a real shout out to Leslie Hagan. She has been inviting us to the National Advocacy Center for many years now. And thanks to her leadership and work, especially working with Native women in the United States, I wanted to highlight that we are now at class number 6 that we just completed in November of 2018. And when she did all the research to find out how many of those attendees actually took our challenge to try to pass new laws and implement new laws, I want to let you know that we are now, I think we're just over 20 tribal codes that have included strangulation and suffocation in their statute. So that's why we said a big thank you to all of you that are on this call, because your leadership and the sharing that you are doing really, really matters. And it was Leslie who said knowledge is power, but knowledge is also responsibility. So thank you for taking that leadership role. You will also see that, as Casey mentioned, I've been taking a close look at the bail statutes. And when it comes to the bail statutes, we have a number of states who are doing it really well. Ohio kind of took it right out of the park. And if you look at the Ohio bail statute, it basically looks like Jackie Campbell's danger assessment tool. Illinois adopted it. Louisiana also included, and Pennsylvania this year has allowed the judges to actually use risk assessment tools into determining bail. The problem I saw when I started to look at this is that each one of these laws passed in honor of a victim who died. Jerry Feynman said that they are called tombstone legislation. So we really wanted to call out bail last year and this year to all of us and to pay closer attention to what's happening. A lot of you are already advocating for this, but I think if we come together, pull all of these different statutes, and bring it to everyone's attention, we will advance our work and victim safety. The other thing was we only have one state that had, one state that has passed a sentencing statute to specifically call out strangulation and suffocation for judges when they consider sentencing. Casey, did you want to?
I just want to make one other comment. You know, that there is a movement in this country in the criminal justice reform work to California has a statute that's been passed that next year will eliminate cash bail as an example. New York is looking at the same thing, and other states in the criminal justice reform and the disparate impacts of incarceration on people of color, on poor people. We're not arguing about that. We're arguing about the fact that whatever the considerations are that a judge should be considering in deciding whether somebody should stay in jail or get out of jail during the pending process of a case, strangulation has to be at the top of the list for judicial considerations. Stranglers are the killers of America. And if we're going to be letting stranglers out over and over again, irrespective of income or irrespective of their background, we're going to end up in trouble. We're going to end up with more people dying because these guys are the scary, dangerous human beings in this country, rage-filled men, almost entirely men. We all know this, that strangulation is a gendered crime, almost entirely men. We've got to continue to raise awareness about how dangerous men are that strangle.
I get a chance to talk about my favorite statute. So going on to the very next one, Go to the next slide. Perfect. There is a nice long list of my favorite ones. I'm not going to talk about each and every one, but I would say come back to it, because for those of you who already passed your laws, your work is not done. We really do want you to go back and see if you need to fix it, like to include positional asphyxia, to really think through what else do we need to include. So I want to highlight a couple as we go forward in the next slide, which is substantial bodily harm. I realized, and as we were doing our research with strangulation, a lot of smart thinkers and creative people went right to their statute that defines substantial bodily harm. And as you could see what Wisconsin did, they actually put in like one petechia, and then they put in loss of consciousness, sight or hearing, or a concussion, which is basically all of the symptoms consistent with somebody who's been strangled or suffocated, which I thought was brilliant. And I'm now collecting all the other statutes from the other states that are starting to do the same thing. But this is a really easy one, I think, to just kind of take a look at the current state of the law and the medical literature on what is substantial bodily harm. And as we're pulling it all together, loss of consciousness is significant. So Casey's already giving me the warning that I need to speed things up, so I will. But okay, I promise. Ohio, great job. Go. Go. Oklahoma, thank you for putting in strangulation into your medical mandated reporting, because as many of you know, uh, it's medical mandating reporting laws probably haven't been looked at for 100 million years. And as strangulation laws have passed, we need to update. And so they did a really good job of updating this.
And there's obviously great controversy about medical mandated reporting, but in most states in America, if somebody is shot or if somebody is stabbed, that's an exception to privacy between a medical professional and somebody seeking medical services. We believe strangulation should be that. For the same reason that Gail calls strangulation the last warning shot, for the same reason that strangulation is the quickest way to kill a human being without a weapon, strangulation should be in the category of a gunshot wound or a stabbing wound if we're going to talk about hospitals bringing in other professionals like law enforcement to address somebody who has been victimized in a gunshot wound or a stabbing wound. Strangulation should be equal. I want to talk just for a minute about what's going on with the Violence Against Women Act authorization. Many of you know that there is draft legislation that the National Task Force and their allied organizations have created because of the transition in the House of Representatives from the Republicans to the Democrats and the ongoing kind of challenges of moving legislation forward. VAWA has expired as we speak. And that's obviously a major concern for many of us, and we're hoping to see that addressed relatively soon. But the new draft legislation for the Violence Against Women Act does not include addressing an issue that we're very concerned about. We believe that just as we have focused on funding streams and support for sexual assault exams, we need to focus on domestic violence forensic exams. We are very concerned about victims who call 911. Paramedics get dispatched. She gets transported to the hospital because she has significant symptomology from a strangulation assault. And days or weeks later, she ends up with a bill for $3,000, $5,000, $10,000. And we are hearing victims experiencing that. That is a great concern to us. So while we're concerned with having forensic exams in all of domestic violence, we're particularly concerned about strangulation assault victims. So we will continue to put out information about that. We have been in communication with the National Task Force that's been working on VAWA, along with Rob Valenti and others who have drafted the current reauthorization language for VAWA. We've been communicating with Senator Feinstein's office here in California, and suffice it to say that this is a big issue for us, is beginning to make sure that victims don't get these massive bills when they need clinical forensic exams. So stay tuned on that topic.
Okay, so now I get to talk about implementation, because as I mentioned, passing the law is one thing, implementing it is another. So looking at this very quickly is that here are just some ideas for implementation in 2019. And you can download this PowerPoint later and you can go right down the checklist consistent with your self-assessment. What I want to highlight in the next slide is that every year we do a survey as to what's happening. This year we found out many of you did go back to your communities to establish strangulation response teams and task force in your community. And oh my gosh, the list is growing. So then I started to put a lot of slides that didn't make the final cut, trying to brag about everybody and what they're doing, because it was like so inspirational to me, but I got to keep at least 3. So what I want to do is highlight, in addition to the slide that you see here, someone that's near and dear to us, which is Mayor Ken Shetter. He attended our last 4-day course, and he's a mover and a shaker and a doer. He went back, and as a mayor, he decided, you know what? I can pass a new ordinance. And his ordinance actually has accountability. He can't put anybody in jail, but he can actually assess a fine. But what this particular ordinance has done has already saved a life. It has not only created a task force, they implemented their protocol that every victim, when an officer finds out that a victim has been strangled, paramedics are called to the scene. And within 30 days of implementation, I don't know if I told you this, they identified a victim that had a fractured highway bone. And the first hospital, because it takes a while to implement, had actually said, thank you very much. We're not going to be able to help you here. But everybody rallied around her and took her to the right hospital. And they're just doing amazing work. I'm going to go to Oregon now. And since they passed their strangulation law, they are moving. As you can see, they established their task force. They have 25 agencies represented. They included a judge. They've already completed their training video. They're doing lineup training, and they're now also working on training all the dispatchers and paramedics. And I think the key is, and what I'm seeing in very mobilized community, is that each and every year they're sending another team and another team to our 4-day course. And the last kind of shout out I want to make is to Professor Catherine Long. She has been pursuing this for many years, and finally her dream came true when she was able to get a grant, a 3-year grant, to really study strangulation injuries. So from here on out, when victims, eventually the goal will be that if you come to a hospital, and let's say you don't acknowledge that you had pressure to your neck, that based on the signs and symptoms, a physician or a nurse can really connect all the dots, because everybody knows that many victims will not report. So, Casey,
I do want to make a comment, because it was just on that slide about this issue of attempted strangulation. We love Catherine's work, but when the media takes this so often, as the Washington Post recently did, they don't call it strangulation, they call it attempted strangulation. And in 2018, we continued to battle this issue. That's why we're creating a media packet at the Institute to be able to really get this word out and give media the kind of information they need to be accurate, medically and legally accurate when they talk about this. It is virtually never attempted strangulation. It is very rarely an attempt. As soon as pressure gets applied to the neck that can block airflow or blood flow in any way, it is a strangulation. The crime can be committed. New York case law has found the crime can be committed in 2 seconds. 1001, 1002, the crime of strangulation is committed. It's not an attempt. And we used to call it attempted strangulation because we thought that if somebody was strangled, they were dead. And that is clearly not true. The vast majority of strangulation victims survive the strangulation assault. And we just want to highlight that, because even though this is about, even Gail's 6 articles in the Journal of Emergency Medicine in 2001 were all called attempted strangulation. That's what we used to call it. We had a good laugh with Jackie Campbell about this a number of years ago, because we found all of ourselves using that phrase, attempted strangulation. But the reality is that the crime is committed as soon as pressure is applied and airflow or blood flow is blocked.
Thank you. So to summarize, we are getting there. Thank you for all your efforts. We are seeing, I would say, this last year, an increase in judicial training. Judges are asking for this training, and they're also implementing this training. Just yesterday, I saw my favorite headline for 2019. I don't know if this could be even surpassed, but the headline read, "Judge finds strangulation is attempted murder." So if And that just, I think, is a testament to training helps all of us do a better job in everything that we wanted to do as public servants. So thank you for doing that. We got a long way to go. The last point I want to make is that your trial briefs and sentencing briefs do matter. That's another great way to educate everybody in that courtroom. And those trial briefs and sentencing briefs are making their way into published decisions. And the last point about published decisions is that we're also finding a lot of great case law that's not being published. And a lot of us are not paying attention, and we have an opportunity, usually within 30, depending on your state, 90 days max, to request publication of good case law.
Just a couple of comments, and we won't spend much time on this because we want to get to the medical piece, but we just continue to raise awareness about this around lethality. Dr. Nancy Glass and Catherine and Jackie Campbell and others in 2008 first identified this issue when they said that if a man places his hand around a woman's neck one time, she is 750% more likely later to be killed by him and 700% more likely to experience his attempt to kill her if it wasn't an attempt in that particular incident. So that was the early research. But I will tell you that there's more and more research coming out that is beginning to tell us more and more about the lethality of this. There is something different about men who strangle, and there's something different about men who strangle over and over again. And obviously, that really creates for us grave concern about the lethality issues around this. The lethality assessment program that Jackie had developed in Maryland with the Maryland Coalition and others that's now going all over the country has been finding this high rate of lethality and the increase in lethality when there are multiple strangulation attempts. And I see what they said in the research. They're still kind of using that word attempted, like he goes for her neck and misses perhaps. But as soon as, again, that pressure is applied, and when it's applied repeatedly, the danger, the risk of later death goes up. I also want to make a quick comment. We've focused a lot on this in 2018 around the relationship between sexual assault and strangulation. Victims of strangulation are more likely to end up being sexually assaulted or to be assaulted as part of the strangulation. When you hear strangulation and bedroom, you are immediately thinking sexual assault, and we have heightened our training on this issue. We also missed the relationship between sexual assault and strangulation until we started looking just this last couple of years at this issue of sexual assault and a murder, sexual killers. And sexual killers, the majority of all victims killed in sexual assaults that end up in murder are actually strangled or suffocated to be killed. That's how the serial rapists and those who are killers strangle them. And you can kind of get this relationship to death, this sense of powerlessness that the victims experience. It connects to suicidal ideation, and it connects to the ability of victims to just lose all hope, because he is literally God and they are not, and he holds their life in his hands. And we're beginning to see really high numbers as we start doing more and more research. There were some early studies done that said, if victims are in shelters, it's a really high number. We kind of saw that because we thought, well, those are high-risk victims going into shelters that are actually in hiding, so that's not a great surprise. But now that we're doing research on strangulation in family justice centers across America, and now that they're looking at it in the use of the lethality assessment program, you're seeing what's happening here. 70, 73, 79, 80%. The Milwaukee studies pushing towards 75% of victims coming into the Family Peace Center in Milwaukee have been strangled before they end up at the Family Justice Center. We don't think that 70 or 80% of all victims of intimate partner violence have been strangled. We think we're seeing the high-risk victims in family justice centers and in domestic violence shelters. But you can see how you have to be talking about this. If we're not screening for it, dialoguing with victims, we've really got to focus there, because even victims don't realize that they're being strangled very often, that pressure being applied to their neck is actually strangulation. So that piece is really important. We're also, as I mentioned, seeing this relationship between sexual assault and strangulation. As sexual assault nurse examiners and forensic nurses get trained, those numbers are rising, to be sure. As we're training TRO professionals or protective order professionals, those numbers are rising. We also think there's some impact going on in the culture, and we saw this in a lot of news stories in 2018. Pressure being applied to the neck, whether it's rear naked choke in the MMA world, whether it's strangulation in pornography, and the pressure being applied to a neck is somehow increasing sexual pleasure. For a woman, being beaten and strangled is somehow about sexual pleasure. It's really important that we be part of those conversations. This is not just fun and games. This is not just, hey, this is a better sexual experience. This is life and death stuff going on, even if perpetrators are saying, well, this is because this is what we like to do. It's a guy thing when they say that. It's virtually never a woman thing to be beaten and strangled in order to have a better intimate relationship. So we need to keep talking about this, and the more we talk about it, the more we're going to be able to address it. We won't spend much time on this, but we just wanted to highlight that we are more and more looking at same-sex relationships as well. Article. And this is a brand new article that just came out in 2018 that's beginning to look at the relationship between same-sex couples and strangulation. And though the early numbers are relatively low, that conversation needs to be happening in the LGBTQI plus community. It needs to be happening in areas where we haven't historically talked about it. And we are interacting at times with the BDSM community and others who are engaged in so-called breath play or other things. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But the reality is that this is life and death stuff, and you can be causing brain damage when you think you're just doing this for pleasure. And we need to engage communities of all kinds in being able to look at the research. I've touched on this, so I'm not going to belabor it. Stranglers are different. We did in the early part of 2018 do an analysis. There were 44 officers killed in the line of duty in intentional homicides in 2017. We've presented this at our courses, but out of those 44 officers, on an internet search of public records, we found that 75% of the killers of police officers had a domestic violence history. And virtually every time when we dug deeper, when we reached out to the jurisdiction, when we asked them to check all criminal history, we found prior non-fatal strangulation. The cop killers of America are the stranglers of women. And it's why we now use this quote. I was honored and humbled to see this quote show up in a published federal appellate decision just recently, because the more we put this out there, the more that the courts are going to embrace it and use it in their decision making in cases. This is the truth. They're the most dangerous offenders on the planet. The most violent rapists are stranglers. The most violent domestic violence offenders are stranglers. The cop killers are stranglers. And that word needs to get out. You know, most of you know we did 2 early studies. One was done by Craig Kingsbury up in Idaho. That one found that about 80% of law enforcement officers who were shot by a criminal suspect were shot by a man who had a history of violence against women. Jerry Feynman did a study in Southern California, found that of officers killed in the line of duty, 50% of them, the killers had a strangulation assault history. And we think those numbers that word still needs to get out. The other piece that we have begun talking about in our 4-day course, probably more so in 2018 than ever before, is the relationship between childhood trauma and the rage of a strangler. A man who strangles a woman is virtually always a man who grew up in a domestic violence, child abuse home, often with a mix of drugs and alcohol. It's not an excuse. They still need to be held accountable, but it's an explanation. We also, in 2018, started adding new information into our course, and I'll touch on this later if we have time to get to it, but we are researching hope in all of our programs. Dr. Chan Hellman, the head of the Hope Research Center, and I have a new book out. The proceeds go to our Camp Hope America program, our camping program for children impacted by domestic violence that's now operating in 20 states. And there's a website, hopescore.com or hopescore.org, if you want to learn a little bit more about the science of hope. But we are talking about it more and more in our strangulation courses. One, because being strangled is the ultimate robber of hope in a woman's life. having this man that says he loves you be right in front of you as he is strangling you almost to death, that piece is a hope robber. And the man that's strangling her, he got robbed of hope a long time ago. And if you really want to be about preventing strangulation, you've got to deal with rage-filled 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boys. You don't want to wait till he's 25 and he's raping and strangling women. The Washington Post just recently did a big article about the relationship between domestic violence homicides, strangulation, profiled Family Justice Center work, profiled high-risk teams, talked about the lethality assessment program. It's a very interesting article. One of the pieces that excited us about the article is we extrapolated their data. They did a deep dive into 5 cities in that article, talking about strangulation initiatives to focus on stranglers, talking about collaborative services in family justice centers. And we were very honored, not surprised, because we track this to see that the city of San Diego, once you adjust for population, had the lowest domestic violence homicide rate of any of the 5 major cities they profiled, 0.21 per 100,000 population, 0.21 domestic violence homicides per 100,000. And the other 2 cities that had relatively low rates were Oklahoma City, where we have a very dynamic family justice center called Palomar, led by a woman named Kim Garrett, and Fort Worth, where Ken Shetter is from, and Michelle Morgan leads One Safe Place. They too had dramatically lower homicide rates with family justice centers in place than Las Vegas, for example, who recently opened a very small center, but for 10 years had nothing. Las Vegas had a 1.86 per 100,000 domestic violence homicide rate, according to the Post. And St. Louis, which does not have a family justice center, was close behind Las Vegas in a very high rate of women murdered in intimate partner relationships. They did not profile this in the story, though they should have, that Oklahoma City has had nobody die that's come to their family justice center framework to get help since they opened nearly 2.5 years ago. Bottom line in the lethality piece, strangulation is a huge red flag. As soon as you hear "he choked me," it should be bells and whistles going off. It's a gendered crime. And those men who strangle women are more likely to be the killers of police officers in this country. A lot of discussion about the fact that we need to get the guns away from stranglers. We need to get the guns away from the most dangerous men on the planet. And most of you know we continue to profile programs like San Mateo, California, and elsewhere, where they are proactively going after men who have restraining orders against them, who have a domestic violence history, who have a history of strangulation, to get the guns away from them, because that's going to save the lives of women as we go forward. It's our great honor now to turn over some of these slides to Dr. Bill Smock, our new medical director at the Training Institute and the chair of our medical advisory board. Dr. Smock, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Casey. Thank you for the honor of joining your team. People out there understand that really Gail and Casey should be up for that Nobel Peace Prize. When we look at what they have done and how their work has created 47 states with felony strangulation statutes. Gail, Casey, thank you for what you've done to save the lives and protect the lives of women all across the world. So when it comes to medical issues, there are certain things that continue to come up. Number one is, what is the definition of strangulation? We try and make it simple. It's the external pressure applied to the neck that blocks airflow, blood flow, or both. That's it. Nice and simple. And that's how you sustain brain damage. That's how you sustain injuries. Some of the new things that we have to help you, one, explain to the court and to jurors what is happening inside the neck when pressure is applied, is this beautiful new diagram that shows the good blood going up, the bad blood coming down, and the vital structures in the neck. Yersinia is our in-house graphic artist and does a beautiful job. And this is available to you for free for downloading to help jurors in the court understand what is happening, and even help our victims understand what is happening when pressure is applied to the neck. And as we move on, other issues, Casey mentioned it earlier, and that was the correlation between the application of pressure and damage to the thyroid gland. There are new articles out there where we know that when pressure is applied to the neck and the thyroid gland is squeezed, it will release thyroid hormones. And what that does is it can cause high blood pressure, rapid heart rate, elevated temperature, really a hyperactivity. So these people come in, we think their heart rate or blood pressure is up because of the trauma of strangulation, but it may in fact be that they're in a thyroid toxicosis, a thyroid storm based upon the release of excess thyroid hormone into their bloodstream. So for the nurses and doctors out there, please think about that and consider ordering one, obviously the CTA, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but consider if they continue to be tachycardic and hypertensive, that this could be a thyroid storm and not the anxiety or the distress of being strangled. The question of petechial hemorrhage, the presence or the absence of petechial hemorrhage in a particular strangulation. Why do we have it in some cases of non-fatal or in cases of fatal strangulation? How can you be fatally strangled without having petechial hemorrhage? That question actually came up this week in Osage Beach at a training in Missouri. And this from Trixie, this is evidence of petechial hemorrhage in the lower extremities. How do we get petechial hemorrhage in the lower extremities? Well, if we remember that petechial hemorrhage is really a rupture of the capillaries from increased venous pressure. So somewhere during the assault, pressure was applied to a vein or veins that kept the blood coming back to the heart. And in that case from Trixie's, when she was assaulted, she had pressure applied to her belly as the assailant was sitting on her abdomen, blocking the inferior vena cava, meaning blocking the blood that was going out to the legs from getting back to the heart, and the pressure increased in her lower extremities. And that's why those capillaries ruptured. This is an example of, so really you can have petechial hemorrhage anywhere in the body. Now when it comes to fatal strangulation, how can you be fatally strangled and have no petechial hemorrhage? Well, when we dissect the medical literature from pressure applied to the neck, we know that the majority of blood gets to the brain and to the head via the carotid arteries. But there is a secondary set of arteries, the vertebrals, that carry 15 to 20% of the oxygenated blood to the brain. And if during the assault we block both the carotid and the vertebrals, there is no inflowing blood to increase pressure in the veins. So, and how does that happen? Well, you can apply pressure either, for example, in a hanging where there is pressure upward, a upward ligature where both the carotid and the vertebrals are blocked, and those individuals are dead, and yet they will have no petechial hemorrhage. And the same thing is true is if we apply pressure low on the neck, where we're blocking the carotid and the vertebral right after it comes off of the subclavian artery, you can be, again, fatally strangled or even non-fatally strangled, be rendered unconscious and even die and have no petechial hemorrhage. So that's something that for the medical experts out there, the nurses, the physicians that are testifying in these cases, being able to explain that to, one, your prosecutor, and then to the court, so that when they say, well, why aren't there petechial hemorrhages? And we used to have prosecutors and police officers around the country that would say, well, no visible injuries, no petechial hemorrhage, strangulation didn't occur. But when you look at the science, clearly you can be strangled fatally, non-fatally, but if you're blocking 100% of blood flow to the brain and to the head, you can have insult without petechial hemorrhage. The timing of brain death from an anoxic insult, based upon the studies and those videotapes, we now know that you can die, stop moving, take your last breath in as little as 62 seconds. And when you look at those videotapes, and these are referenced, and this is, again, something that you can download from the website as a resource of being able to explain what is the time sequence. Once pressure is applied at time 0, what happens when that pressure is maintained? The time to go unconscious based upon the Rosen study. When do you have your anoxic seizure? When do you lose bowel or bladder control? And then when do you take your last breath? The part of the brain that controls our breathing and heart rate is in the brainstem, the medulla. And that is the part of the brain that is the least sensitive to anoxia and the last part of the brain to die, which is why you can still be technically alive but have no brain activity and only your heart beating because the brainstem is still alive. You need to be able to explain that to the jury. One of the other questions that continues to come up is the use of the carotid restraint or lateral vascular neck restraint. I just this morning sent to the Missouri Highway Patrol a request they had for this PowerPoint, because there are still some agencies that have not banned this or permit the use of the carotid restraint when a suspect is actively resisting. When I look at what major cities have done across the United States, is that they have changed their policy or have policies in place that recognize that the use of the carotid restraint is lethal force, just like drawing your gun, because the potential consequences include serious physical injury, brain damage, and death. Just the same sort of injuries that you would expect to see if you were shot. And there's really no difference. And we train our military to apply pressure to the neck in hand-to-hand combat because it is the most effective way of rendering another human being unconscious and to kill them. Because if it only takes 6.8 seconds on average to render an adult male unconscious, then once they're unconscious, you just maintain that pressure on the neck and you kill all the brain cells, and then you are done. So this PowerPoint is available. Download as a PDF if you want to educate your training command staff and your sheriff or your police chief on what are the risks and what of using the carotid restraint, even to police officers. Having one of my officers at a smaller agency stroke during the lateral vascular neck restraint training. He's now dead. But is it worth the risk of causing one of your officers to stroke or die to train them in this? We don't shoot officers to let them know that the bullet is an effective way, and I don't think we need to apply pressure to the neck and kill or cause our officers to stroke. We have given a survey to our law enforcement officers that attend our training, and it's curious how many agencies permit. Some agencies outright ban it, but then when we break down those that permit it is for a lethal force only. So there have been cases around the country where officers have actually been indicted or charged by using neck restraints, including the rear naked choke, because that not only blocks the carotids, but also blocks the vertebrals. So, and then the question is, if you do apply the lateral vascular neck restraint to a suspect to effect an arrest, do you medically clear them? Do you take them to the hospital and make sure that they have that CTA? Otherwise, you could end up with an in-custody death where your suspect will then stroke. So these recommendations are available in the PowerPoint that I've given around the country, that the carotid restraint should be reserved for lethal or deadly force. That is what can happen when we apply that pressure. And if your agency does elect to train your officers in the use of the carotid restraint, please, no pressure applied to the neck during the vascular neck restraint training, because my officer who stroked during training, a piece of plaque from the carotid artery broke off and showered his brain. And 10 minutes into the training, he was exhibiting signs of stroke. And then again, please, if you do use it, medically clear that individual. And this could be an officer. If an officer has the restraint applied to them by a suspect, one that is clearly lethal force being applied to the officer, but please make sure that officer is medically cleared. And we have provided the recommendations, the medical evaluation, the radiographic evaluation of who needs to have a CTA. We have now recognized that the CTA is the easiest test to obtain. It is really the test of choice in adults because of the ease. Any hospital that has a CT scanner can also perform that CTA. And what's great in a busy emergency department is that if you do have the CTA, you can get that patient released and discharged and open up that bed because they are safe to go home. Some of the pushback that we have gotten early on, and we continue to educate hospitals and doctors around the world, is that, is this medically necessary? And clearly it is. It is preventive medicine. What we're finding is that the incidence of carotid dissection or other serious injuries are somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 50 strangled victims will have one of these serious physical injuries. And if it is a dissection and they certainly have the risk of stroke, we want to prevent that. Who's going to fund it? Well, I don't care how it's funded. It's what the patient needs, and whether it's covered by a crime victims comp fund, it's restitution as part of the court's ruling or what they do with the suspect, but it needs to be done. The risk of radiation, there really isn't one. The radiologists say there is a theoretical risk of 1 in 10,000 patients who have a CTA will develop some sort of thyroid cancer down the road, but at the incidence or risk of stroke is 1 to 50 to 1 in 100. Clearly, the benefits of doing the CTA speak for themselves. And if we have negative findings, then that reassures me as the physician, reassures the patient that they are safe to go home and they will not stroke or die, because we've actually seen that. We've had cases of victims who have been strangled. They go to a hospital and the physician is uneducated about the need for the CTA. And we've had officers who then took them to another hospital, got the CTA, and the CTA has been positive where they had a dissection. So one, we prevented that patient from stroking, possibly dying, and we've also prevented that hospital from being sued and that physician from being sued because they missed a preventable injury. They missed the carotid dissection. We do have this new 4-minute video. So if you can only capture your ER doc's attention for 4 minutes, please have them review this. It will give them the information that they need to understand the risks associated with strangulation and the benefits of doing a CTA. Hospitals across the country and actually the world now are adopting this protocol, and it is saving lives because it's recognizing those injuries that are not seen internally. We know that many of these victims with carotid dissections have no external injury. And hopefully gone are the days where the ER doctor says, well, there are no marks on the neck, they're asymptomatic, they can go home. Because we can show you case after case where victims with serious physical injuries have no external injuries. And if that's what you're using as your criteria, you are mistaken and you will cause patients to stroke. We've had great success. This is out of Australia, the article where they have adopted the protocol from the Institute, and it is clearly saving lives. We're very happy to be a part of that. Our doctors from Australia, these are, when Gail and I were there in March, the radiologists, after hearing our information, sent out an email to all the physicians in that community in Canberra, Australia, saying, we're going to be doing CTAs. We've been missing these injuries. And so in one fell swoop, all the physicians in that city, actually in that province of Australia, have now been educated and are doing the CTA. A great day. Something new, we've also come up with a protocol on what to do with the pregnant victim who has been strangled. So, and thanks to all the doctors, the members of the committee, Dr. Weaver Ravello, Sally Hennon, and our outstanding superstar forensic nurses, Bob Barkmeyer, Annie Lewis O'Connor, Jen Johnson, Stacy Mitchell, and there are other just superstar forensic nurses out there that are really pushing the envelope. Diana Fogno, Val Severs, Jen Green, when it comes to the pediatric program. We couldn't do this without the support of our forensic nurses. And you've heard me say this before, but given the state of our current medical knowledge, what we know now about carotid dissections and vertebral artery dissections, it is malpractice not to order that CTA in the non-fatal strangled patient when they have evidence of petechial hemorrhage, unconsciousness, painful swallowing. Those are the indications based upon the medical literature of when you need to do a CTA. And we now know, again, based on the literature, that you could have a dissection months, even years after the assault. When it comes to the pediatric issue, we've had a fantastic, actually 2 webinars, and here's going to shout out to Kathy Baldwin Johnson from Alaska, as well as Diana, Katie Snyder, Val Sievers. They are doing the work when it comes to the pediatric patient, because there are some differences anatomically. The instance, what we're finding based upon what we have know so far, is that the instance of dissection is less in the pediatric population, probably because their arteries are more pliable. But what Kathy has seen, actually more instance of anoxic and hypoxic brain injuries in those pediatric patients, from their brain being really suffocated and those cells dying. And those hypoxic and anoxic insults aren't showing up for days to weeks later after the strangulation. So there is information available that is coming your way. We did do a brief summary of what our pediatric hospitals doing, and some are doing nothing, some are doing the CTA, some are using the MRA as the test of choice. In my pediatric level 1 trauma center, if you're 15 and above, you get a CTA. If you're 14 and below, you will get an MRA. So each hospitals are different. I would look to your pediatric radiologist to say, what is your test of choice when we get a strangled patient in? And we do not want to miss those internal injuries that could be life-threatening in our pediatric population. So more to come on that.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks. We could go on for hours. You get this sense, all of the 400 folks on this call, we could go on for hours on this. And we've got so much information now, and an amazing group of doctors and nurses joining us in this. And thanks, Bill, for your leadership. And we look forward to you becoming more and more involved with us as we develop really more hands-on forensic clinical services in family justice centers and communities across America. One of the big themes of 2018 was simply getting strangulation protocols into communities, challenging communities, as Gail talked about earlier, to start initiatives, to focus on this, to create dialogue. So as we head into 2019, kind of our big question is, do you have protocols? Do you have an initiative? Do you have a task force? Have you sent people to our 4-day course? And then what have you done with it? The new San Diego protocol just recently came out. It builds on work over the last 20 years that we've done in San Diego, but it was updated, and it's a great reference for us. We have it available on our website for you to look at. We've got great examples of outreach and community awareness and billboard campaigns and other things to raise awareness, not just about domestic violence, but about strangulation as well. And we know the kinds of things now that should be in initiatives and protocols. We wanted to give a shout out to the Tulsa Family Safety Center and Suzanne Stewart and the work they did and have been doing after they sent a team to our 4-day course and then went back and really benchmark what they were doing and began to track it and began to focus on initiative protocols, policies, procedures. I don't think it's any coincidence at all that Oklahoma City and Tulsa have seen significant drops in homicides and domestic violence, and particularly those drops in Tulsa are a result of this one truth. They're going after the stranglers. And when you go after the stranglers, you're going to save the lives of women and children and police officers. Maricopa County, Jill Rabel and Dan Rincon and the whole team in Maricopa County saw this first. There's Jill Rabel even pictured there on the right with their forensic examination program that is running now, getting exams in about 85% of strangulation cases in Maricopa County. And you can see what's happened to homicides as they continue to focus on the stranglers, going after the stranglers and providing the advocacy services and the medical services that victims need. If we go after the stranglers, we're going to reduce domestic violence homicides in this country dramatically. They are the killers. They are the ones that put victims in the most danger and police officers in the most danger. We're not going to spend much time on this, but we do just want to highlight we're continuing to focus on investigation. We have developed developed a first responders chapter that's available to you on our website. And that first responders chapter, one of the chapters is on the role of dispatchers. Without a doubt, we have figured out that dispatchers are crucial to this. Gail was probably the first person to really start focusing on this and realize we weren't getting dispatchers to our trainings because dispatchers are not always invited to these kinds of trainings. They often do their own trainings. So IACP has spent a lot of time on this. We are now partnering with IACP, that's the International Association of Chiefs of Police, doing a lot of work with IACP on near and non-fatal strangulation. And we've got these great resources that have developed this year. We also wanted to highlight that we have our online course still available. It's on our website at strangulationtraininginstitute.com or .org. You can see on the screen. It's free. We built it with the Pennsylvania State Troopers and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence a number of years ago. We've now updated it. We had some technical difficulty, but we fixed that. That allows officers, sworn and non-sworn personnel for that matter, to take the course. It takes about 30 minutes. They can take a final exam on it. They can pass it. They can print out a completion certificate. So we've had departments all over the country ordering it for everybody in their department, sworn and non-sworn. And we're averaging about 6,000 folks taking it a year. That's available to you still. And even in our revamped website that's about to come out, it will also be available right off the homepage. Gail mentioned earlier that we're doing lineup and roll call videos. Arizona did a great one. Oregon did a great one. We just produced one for the Colorado Attorney General that's beginning to play in lineups and roll calls. And we're excited to announce that Michael Burke and our Institute team are working on a general roll call video that can be used anywhere in the country that we will produce in 2019, working with our legal committee and all the officers that are involved in our legal committee. We will have a video, thanks to Dan Rincon and many others that have been helping us on this, so that you can have something to play for your officers in a quick 8 to 9 minute spot. We're also focusing a lot on forms still. We continue to push this. You need specialized reporting forms that are a supplement to a narrative, not that take the place of a narrative police report, but are the supplement to a narrative. And more jurisdictions are creating specialized forms. San Diego's new form has just been posted to our website, and you can take a look at that. We also wanted to give a shout out to a brand new trend in 2018, and that is getting crime scene investigators, getting CSI units out to the scene of strangulation calls. Catherine Scheimreif in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in North Carolina, where we're currently planning a family justice center with Craig Varnum and Laura Lawrence and a lot of agencies there. They're now going out on these calls, and typically CSI doesn't roll on anything but murder cases or maybe violent sexual assault cases, but they're starting to roll there. Catherine's team, which now has grown to almost 30 people with interns and crime scene techs, are rolling on these. And of course, the evidence gets better, and they're more able to prosecute cases when they don't depend on simply a police officer to do the entire on-scene investigation. We're also doing a lot of focus on paramedics. We are beginning to really engage paramedics in understanding that just walking away from the scene when she says she doesn't want medical attention or even a screening is a really bad idea, because delayed death is happening in these cases, and a victim's neck will swell. EMS blows it off and says, well, if you don't want to go, sign here, and they walk out the door and the victim's dead within 24 hours. So we're beginning to really raise awareness on that. We were very excited this past year to finalize what's called a strangulation assessment card, again, available to you. We can make it available to jurisdictions across America. NYPD, New York City Police Department, has been using this form, and they have a version adapted for their own department. So they're handing this out to victims, that it includes not only an educational piece for victims, but it gives victims something if they go to a medical provider or get transported to hand to the doctors and nurses in the ER or an urgent care clinic to say, you need to pay attention to this because I could die from this, and you need to focus on imaging, and you need to get educated if you're not educated about it. We have a good webinar available on our website that Dr. Ralph Riviello helped with on the role of paramedics. Dr. Bill Smock, many years ago, served as a paramedic and does a lot of training as well of paramedics. But I love seeing this information get out. Gail has worked very hard on a new chapter this last year for paramedics, just like we did for dispatchers. What's the role of EMS and what should they be doing? What's the standard of care? I love the fact that we did a 4-day training this last year in One Safe Place. You can see the picture on the left. That is a paramedic supervisor. Do you remember his name? I don't remember his name.
Oh, sorry.
Well, we'll remember his name because he deserves credit for this. I asked him a question during our mock crime scene when he was interviewing a victim, a mock victim in front of our entire institute. And I said, so how often do you fail at getting a victim transported when she needs to be transported? And he said, fail? I never fail. I've learned how to tell them how important this is, and I get them all transported. Wouldn't that be great if that was the standard in America, that you simply don't take no for an answer if you fear for the safety or life of a victim at the scene of a strangulation assault? We're also doing more in our 4-day courses and in our institutes around interviewing traumatized victims. We wanted to give a shout out to David Lezak and Tom Tremblay and Becky Campbell and Russell Strand for all the work they're doing in forensic experiential interviewing. We don't do their full courses, certainly not Russell Strand's full course, but we have added that piece because understanding trauma is really important. We have a little kind of fact scenario here that's pretty typical of a case that Gail framed out in typical cases that you all are seeing around the country. You can scan that real quick. We're not going to spend much time on it, but the bottom line is, this is a typical scenario. A victim gets strangled, reports it to the police. She minimizes, they minimize. She probably doesn't get the medical attention that's necessary. She declines it. Then she starts having symptomology. She tells a friend. She ends up at the ER. The ER is a terrible place to get forensic medicine help in America, as she sits for 3, 4, 5 hours waiting to be seen. She leaves the hospital. Her symptoms continue. She's got all kinds of symptomology. Eventually, she ends up back in that scene. And when she finally ends up back in that scene, she ends up at a point where the hospital hasn't adopted our imaging protocol. They're not doing CTAs. She's got memory issues. She's got all kinds of challenges she's facing physically and emotionally. And months later, let's say 2 months later, she ends up at her family doctor. And the family doctor, of course, thinks, oh, this is probably psychosomatic. It's just stress. And if a doctor doesn't know the answer, they often say, oh, it's probably all in your head. Dr. Smock, what should that doctor be doing 2 months later when she's sitting in their office with this kind of symptomology and this kind of case history?
Well, the doctor probably hasn't been trained and doesn't understand how the brain responds, one, to either the neuroendocrine trauma, the physical trauma, or the anoxic and hypoxic trauma that a victim who's been strangled can sustain. So he's probably not ordering the appropriate tests, and there would be several. One, does she have an MRI of the brain to look for evidence of hypoxic or anoxic injuries? 2, she is still in that window of less than 12 months where she would need a CTA. They probably don't understand that. And 3, they probably don't understand that they need to be referred to a neurologist with specialized training in traumatic brain injury, and may even need neuropsych testing to determine what parts of her brain are now not functioning as they did prior to that strangulation or multiple strangulations.
Well, that's great, and it's a good reminder that not only would we need that screening for traumatic brain injury, but we need to understand what's going on with the victim. She's not only being robbed of hope, she's experiencing stunningly traumatic life and death event. We used a video heavily in 2018 called Trauma in the Brain that's available both on YouTube and on download from our resources. But we wanted to give a shout out to that. There's lots of new articles now coming out on traumatic brain injury. We've been doing a lot of work with this with Dr. Jackie Campbell. Dr. Jackie Campbell, by the way, will be presenting on this at our conference in March in San Diego. She has also been working with us on a number of grant proposals. We've been going after money to continue to do more on this, she and her team. And we just wanted to highlight a few of those articles because we are not screening for this well. The dynamic of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and other types of brain injury is not just unique to football players in America. It is happening probably more to battered women than to any other group of people on the planet, and we continue to miss it in many, many, many cases. The definitions, we talk about acquired brain injury, we talk about traumatic brain injury, we talk about concussive injuries, we talk about anoxic and hypoxic brain injury. We're spending more and more time in our courses on all of these things. I'm not going to spend much time on it now, though I would, Bill, just like you to briefly talk about this important need for concussion evaluation in the middle of these kinds of cases as well.
Yes, when a woman is strangled, at least in the cases that I've seen, they're not lying there, please, honey, strangle me. They're being shaken, so their brain is going back and forth across the hard surfaces of the inside of the skull. Their head is being pounded against the floor. Their head's being pounded against the wall. All that causes concussive brain injury. And we need to be aware of that and do some sort of screening. And unfortunately, because of the nature of brain injuries, these may be subtle findings. It may only be the people that know the individual prior to the assault that say, yeah, now her memory is a problem, or her personality has changes, or now she's can't sleep at night. Those same sort of symptoms that we expect to see and look for in a concussion are when our child gets knocked out on the football field. We need to be aware that those same sort of symptoms and injuries can occur to a victim who has been assaulted and strangled.
Well, thank you. We're not going to spend much time on this as we begin to head toward the finish line here today, except to tell you that we have a lot more resources and a lot more things we're focusing on around brain injury and domestic violence. We've also focused a lot in 2018 on clinical documentation. There's certainly great resources out there. The Academy of Forensic Nursing is pursuing a specialty. A lot of our attendees have created specialized evaluation toolkits or strangulation kits, much like rape exam kits, which we're very excited about. We've also engaged pretty heavily in the conversation in this country around alternative light source issues. We don't have the time to go deep in this, except to say, beware. If you have questions about the use of alternative light source, I challenge you to reach out to us, reach out to Dr. Bill Smock. We can dialogue with you on this. We're very concerned about alternative light source being used recklessly or being used in situations where you don't have anything external and then you may have something external, internal that you can't see, and then it shows up. I'm not going to spend much time on this except to say, please talk to us about all of that. I did want to highlight this. This is something that's happening regularly in our work. Somebody that comes to our course then sees something, learns something. This showed up in an alternative light source picture of the victim's neck. And you can see where it came from. Nurse Melinda Wheeler, who is a graduate of our course and does a lot of her own training now, was treating a strangled domestic violence victim, and a woods lamp showed that marking. It's an invisible permanent tattoo put on her neck by her trafficker. She will live with it for the rest of her life. And that's a great example of the use of a woods lamp in a strangulation assault that told us that this is not just a domestic violence victim, this is a trafficking victim. We've learned a lot about defenses in these cases. We mentioned this earlier. The criminal defense bar is trying everything they can. They're getting more sophisticated. Some of them are going with, I didn't touch her. More are going with, I was only defending myself. The consent sex defense in some form is definitely on the rise. And we are now consulting regularly in cases where the perpetrator says that she committed suicide, when in fact evidence, if a good investigation is done, it becomes clear that he actually killed her and then made it look like a suicide. Big highlights on the I didn't touch her. We think the neck should be getting swabbed. Bill, you want to make a quick comment on this? The neck can be swabbed very simply and easily, but we're pushing this hard. It's time to collect DNA, perp's hands and the victim's neck.
Right. We've only got one chance, because if we're going to find the DNA that's been transferred during the assault, we need to do it immediately. If we say, we're not going to do it, we have missed an opportunity to lose that evidence, because it will wash away. So just do it. It may not show anything, but it may, particularly when they say, I never put my hands anywhere near her neck.
And we may not even have to test it. It gives the detective a tool to say, when I test that swab, is that going to show me that you put your hands on her neck? We're getting some good case law coming out that is supporting the use of DNA testing in those situations. And we spend a lot more time on that at our master's course and some of our more advanced courses, but this is important. The self-defense piece, we're continuing to see experienced abusers always say self-defense. We saw an interesting trend. We've been pushing hard in 2016, 17 to get more and more states to focus on passing and implementing primary aggressor laws. And we've seen, you can see the numbers right there. 11 more states this last year adding primary aggressor laws or amending their primary aggressor laws because we've got to give officers the tools to screen between the initial aggressor versus the primary aggressor. We cannot have victims of strangulation being arrested because all of the injuries are on the perpetrator and she has very little. If he has significant injuries in a strangulation case, it means she thought she was going to die and she was fighting for her life. So this primary aggressor piece is really important. We continue to be tracking these, and I don't know, Gail, if you want to make a comment about it, but kids continue to die in this choking game all over America.
Yes. Well, you know that in my spare time, I like to read case law, and this is probably one of my favorite cases related to the specific issue, and it's worth reading. It was very clear, you talk about the consent case. This whole case was on video, and it was clear that this was two teenagers playing this game, and I think one kid agreed to be choked. He was bored for cigarettes. The whole incident was videotaped, and the issue was, how can you convict me? He consented. Well, the court said what we've been saying all along in our trainings: you can't consent to something that can kill you. And that was the finding, and he was sentenced to 3 years. But it's worth reading.
And that continues to come up, including the accident defense, which is similar, where they say, I didn't mean to do it. Bill, you want to just make a quick comment about that? Because we don't think there's an accident that happens virtually ever.
No, this is an accident, but this has been used as a defense that, I didn't mean to kill her. I just stimulated her carotid sinus and she died. Well, in looking at the medical literature and looking at actual controlled studies of carotid sinus stimulation, people don't die. There was a study where 1,400 octogenarians had their carotid sinus stimulated. None of them died, no complications. So for the prosecutors out there, if this comes up as a potential defense, make sure that your medical expert understands that this is not a defense. It doesn't happen. Yes, it can lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, but it doesn't kill you.
We're not going to spend much time on this, but the Institute is a resource to you in questionable cases where the question is there a suicide or a homicide? Bill's been doing consulting just this past year in cases that have come to the Institute where law enforcement has reached out to us to ask those questions. We now have families at times reaching out to us where a case has been ruled a suicide. And in fact, after further investigation, it's been determined that it was a homicide. It should be no great surprise that rage-filled homicidal men who strangle women then want to make it look like a suicide after they kill her. So just know that we are a resource to you in these kinds of cases all over the country. There's also this ongoing battle we saw this last year. It's no big deal. Everybody's doing it. The MMA fighters do it. Martial artists do it. The cops do it. It's just no big deal. Yes, the Training Institute's making it sound like it's some serious thing, but it's not really that serious a thing. And that's when you get to say, liar, liar, pants on fire. Because it is unbelievably significant and we can prove it. And more research is coming out saying that life and death cases are involved in strangulation. We are working on a new chapter as we speak for prosecuting non-fatal strangulation cases. As most of you know, Gail and I were honored a number of years ago to co-edit a book called The Investigation and Prosecution of Strangulation Cases with Gene Jordan and the California District Attorneys Association. And we're now working to update that information for other jurisdictions. We have continued to provide materials from our manual to other states to create their own manual. Alaska's created a manual, and a number of other states are working on manuals. And we are absolutely convinced that every state in America needs a resource like this. If you're not familiar with the manual that we produced in California and that is now being replicated, please reach out to us. And again, we've touched on it before. We want to make sure that we stay engaged in the conversation about victim safety and the rights of criminal defendants. The challenges around bail reform and criminal justice reform are important conversations that we need to be having. But if we end up letting the most dangerous men out of jail and they end up killing not only their victim or police officers or others, that's just absolutely unacceptable. So we all need to stay involved in this conversation. Gail gave one example of a case. Gail, you just want to touch on that real quickly?
Yes, I would say that since April, I've been obsessed with this particular issue, and I've been obsessed with it because it not only came up in our Google alerts, but ever since then, we are now tracking about every 10 days somebody is dying in America as a result of somebody who was either released from jail on his own recognizance or a very low amount of bail. So this is a very important issue. I will just highlight this one where it just broke my heart. It was a mother and daughter who were strangled. He was out on bail. He had already had a conviction. The prior conviction was reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor. So you can assess these cases any way you want, but everything kind of leads back to that one issue. We have got to take strangulation cases seriously. And then this was the second one, and I'm not going to let go of this issue no matter what. When I saw Officer Gannon being killed by somebody who actually, this was the real heartbreaker. 6 months before he was killed, he actually responded to the DV call that involved a strangulation assault. Then you go 6 months later, he is executing a warrant because he did not go back to court. And he was on bail facing 27 different counts of firearm violation, trafficking, assault and battery, and ultimately Officer Gannon was shot and killed, and so was his police dog. It was an absolute heartbreak, and it was a heartbreak to the whole community. But those two cases in particular has really set us into a whole new direction, including making new friends. I think pretrial services will be the key to this solution, and they will be our target. We have to go find them. And I think we have a partner with Jim Henderson helping us educate probation officers and others on this very important issue.
Gail tracks the case law on strangulation all over America. Many of you know Gail teaches law school in San Diego in her spare time. I don't know when that is, but she does teach law school. And the case law that's coming out that Gail is finding all over the country is really amazing. Good cases. Everywhere we go, we're getting great cases.
So it's kind of hard to pick your favorites, but I think I did. I've got one from Montana. Thank you, people from Montana. I think what we're going to do, we might even have the prosecutors come talk about this story. But this case is worth reading. It really is the best medical diagnosis case that we have found. Everything came in. What the victim told the medical team, and what I think drove everyone crazy is that she even got to say not only who did it, what did he do, but that she thought she was going to die. And I just saw an amazing appellate decision there. I got to talk about Cody next. I would say this is close tie. Cody, oh my gosh. This represents prosecutors, police officers, forensic nurses all working together. And in this particular case, they went forward without the victim's testimony. Everything that could go bad did. Within 5 phone calls and in violation of a restraining order, the victim recanted. She even hired a civil attorney. The prosecutor would not give up. The victim even went into court, took the fifth. And because the prosecutor knew forfeiture by wrongdoing inside and out, was able to navigate this. Very good opinion and worth reading.
So courts are beginning to realize the dangerousness of strangulation, and we're excited about that. This is all available in the download for this webinar, the cases that you see, whether it's courts talking about positional asphyxia, whether it's courts talking about the need for what prosecutors do and don't have to prove, that they don't have to identify all these potential symptoms in order to prove that somebody was strangled. We're seeing a trend with the graduates of our course now prosecuting non-fatal strangulation cases as attempted murder. We're seeing appellate cases now come out because prosecutors and law enforcement officers are working together on these to get them to attempted murder cases. When he is taking her to unconsciousness and she is urinating or defecating, that is an attempted murder case. Very often we believe, and we've seen multiple cases in 2018, we think that he strangles her to unconsciousness and eventually stops because he thinks she's dead, and then she wakes up. And if he strangles her till he thinks she's dead, that's called attempted murder in the United States of America. We touched on this earlier at the beginning of our long journey here over the last 2 hours. Experts are crucial to these cases. We are continuing to see these great cases like Ruth Downing's case out of Ohio, where forensic nurses are able to testify as experts. We're also doing a lot of work around probation and parole. Gail mentioned Jim Henderson at Battered Women's Justice Project and his partnership with us, and now beginning to think about what training we can put out for probation and parole. We're working on a chapter on that right now. And then the last piece before we wrap up, and our time is short, is the advocacy piece. Gail, you just want to mention the brochure piece? We've probably done more of those in 2018 than we've ever done.
I'm going to mention two things, then I'm going to let you finish with hope. I would say this is a very proud project, and thank you, Kevin, for allowing us to include this. As you can see, communities all over the world are actually taking up on this offer, where you can customize your brochure to help educate victims of strangulation of what they need to worry about. And we're very concerned about those long-term health consequences. And this is how you do it. There's one more I want to highlight, and this is our beautiful, wonderful resources from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network on traumatic brain injury. As soon as we go live with our new web site, we're going to be uploading these resources with their permission. Just excellent that you can use to educate victims. And then Casey, if we're going to skip risk assessment tools, because I think it's really time to talk about hope, and let's give you the last word.
And we do appreciate the fact that there's lots of people doing great work around the country on risk assessment, from the LAP, from the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center, and others. But at the end of the day, the message on lethality and risk assessment is you need to be screening for risk of lethality in these cases. Whenever you hear "he choked me," those cases need to go to the top of the list. Last piece for us is, and I mentioned this earlier, we've been putting hope into everything we're doing. Many of you know that I wrote our first book on the adverse childhood experiences study called Cheering for the Children in 2015. It was a book that really told the story of Camp Hope America, our Camp Hope America program. And the new book that I touched on earlier, Hope Rising, that just came out, is a book that really explains the science of hope. And people say, well, why are you doing that in the middle of a strangulation course? Because victims are getting robbed of hope, and hope is more predictive of anything else. When we were starting to plan the Family Justice Center in Mecklenburg, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina, this mural is in the lobby of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and Craig Varnum showed it to me there, and I thought that's exactly what our job is to give hope. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study has done more to explain how childhood trauma produces the next generation of stranglers in America than anything else. It's why we've added to our course having people measure their own ACE scores if you do the work, and beginning to look at the ACE scores of perpetrators, not because it's an excuse for terrible things that often men do to women in strangulation assaults, but it's an explanation, and it's where we make the difference. We are now training in our strangulation courses about who are the child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault offenders, their childhood trauma kids. We are also correlating it to the work our organization does with children exposed to domestic violence who have similar high ACE scores as the perpetrators. and we're figuring out and advocating for, you can love them at 10 or you can lock them up at 25. It's your call, because they're the same kids. How much more moral and how much better to try to focus your programs, not just on strangulation cases after it's happened, but how to prevent them to begin with. We wanted to give a shout out to Melissa Jeltsin before we were done. Amazing work she's doing at HuffPost on domestic violence, including profiling our proactive programs. And this quote is probably important to include. If you're doing work in the area of strangulation and you're not focusing on increasing and taking care of hope in your own life, you cannot give what you do not have. And strangulation assault survivors are never going to recover unless we help increase hope in their lives. That was the finding of our book. This is now a slide in every one of our strangulation prevention courses. Rising hope is crucial to a life well lived. We need to protect our own lives from the impacts of vicarious trauma. We need to figure out pathways for survivors to find hope in their life in order to be able to heal after these unbelievably traumatic events. If you're not on our mailing list, you can take your cell phone even as we speak and text the word Hope Giver, all one word, no spaces, to 22828. To join our list, we'll send out announcements about not only our Family Justice Center conference, but about our strangulation events that are upcoming. And again, I want to thank Kevin Sweeney and the whole team at OVW for their support. We are honored beyond words to be able to do this work. And it is humbling, and it is a sacred responsibility.